all eyes are on the buildup of Russian troops at the Ukrainian border. But Moscow's also deployed thousands of troops backed by warplanes to Belarus. It's the largest military exercise between the two countries in decades. As tensions rise in Eastern Europe, will the Kremlin remove the troops after the war games are over? Or will they become a permanent fixture to counter so-called NATO aggression? NATO has described the latest drills as Russia's biggest deployment to Belarus since the Cold War. The exercises involve some 30,000 troops, many of them close to the Polish and Ukrainian borders. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has sounded the alarm, saying the West must prepare for the worst. The United States is concerned the deployment will increase tensions and could be a cover for an invasion of neighbouring Ukraine. Moscow denies that. There are fears that Russian troops could be stationed in Belarus permanently once the drills are over. In an interview with Foreign Policy, the Polish foreign minister said the military build-up in Belarus seems to be something more permanent, unfortunately, and it's a great concern of ours. Russia says it has no intention of establishing a permanent deployment in Belarus. So how concerned should Europe be? Let's bring in our panel to find out. From Kiev, Alexander Khara, former advisor to the Ministry of Defence of Ukraine. From Northamptonshire here in the UK, Keir Giles, a senior consulting fellow of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. And in Vilnius, Lithuania, Franak Viačorka, political advisor to the exiled opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Keir, let me start with you because this Russian deployment to Belarus has been described as the biggest since the end of the Cold War. 30,000 troops, fighter jets, missiles, S-400 air defense systems. What do you make of it?
Well, there are two separate things going on here. First of all, there's the immediate crisis. There is the threat to Ukraine, which Russia has been building up now since October of last year in order to extract all of its demands from NATO and the West for rolling back NATO's protections of its eastern members over and above its designs on Ukraine itself. But then, of course, there's the much longer running story of Russia's designs for integrating Belarus, for restricting Belarus as a sovereign independent nation, which up until just last year, Belarus was resisting fairly successfully. We had President Lukashenko making it plain that he did not wish his security to be outsourced to Russia. Now, since August 2020 and the protests that followed the elections there that saw President Lukashenko re-anointed, there has been much greater reliance on Russia and much less resistance to Russia moving in. Of course, if these troops may stay, and that is what everybody is always watching for when you see Russian military deployments to Belarus, no matter what they're used for, will they actually go home at the end? Because if they don't, that's a huge new additional problem for all of Belarus's neighbors, not just Ukraine, but also its NATO neighbors, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania.
Yeah, that is the key question. Franak, the timing of this is significant. What is the view in Belarus? Are these war games really just a cover for increasing the Russian buildup close to the Ukrainian border?
Oh, definitely. Drills are a cover-up for a larger, broader, and more dangerous operation. But for Belarusian people, it's not acceptable. We saw some surveys, and they show that Belarusians are not very happy with the idea that Russian troops will stay at their territory. But Lukashenko has to demonstrate loyalty to Putin. Tomorrow he is actually going to Russia. He gave an interview a few days ago saying that he is ready to deploy whatever troops, even nuclear weapons in Belarus, if it can help joint defense of Russia and Belarus. But let's remember, Lukashenko was playing this geopolitical seesaw for many, many years. Now he's very weak. He doesn't have support even among core supporters. There is no unified power vertical as before. So the only hope he has right now is Russia.
This puts a lot of pressure on Kiev. There's already this massive buildup of troops along the Ukrainian border. Now there's these extra troops in Belarus. What is Kiev making of this?
Certainly, it's of major concern for Ukraine because our capital is under threat of attack from the Belarusian territory. And Lukashenko was talking about joining the Russian forces if there is a war between Russia and Ukraine. But I'd like to bring some more details into the whole picture, and we should not just focus on what's going on in Belarus. When the Russians annexed Crimea, they begin to militarize the peninsula, and it enabled them an ability to project its power beyond the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So the Russians are doing the same thing in the northern part of the map with Belarus. And certainly these forces are aimed at the moment at Ukraine, but in the future, certainly they will be tasked to get support for Kaliningrad enclave and get through the Suwalki Gap. And there is another aspect to that. In 2014, the Russians began to restore the nuclear storage facilities of the Soviet time, and we have all, let's say, evidence that the Russians deployed tactical nuclear missiles. And if we are talking about Belarus, last December, Mr. Lukashenko proposed amendments to constitution, and he took out the article where Belarus was proclaimed as non-nuclear state. And after that, the foreign minister of Belarus was talking that this aggressiveness of NATO demands deploying the Russian nuclear on the Belarusian territory. So it's going to change completely the whole European security architecture.
Okay, so a lot of concern about what kind of equipment Russia is possibly placing in Belarus. Christian May, the head of the NATO and European Union Department in Estonia's defense ministry, said, "We recognize that Belarus has always been in Russia's sphere of influence, but Belarus had always resisted having Russian troops permanently stationed there. What we're seeing at this moment are strategic capabilities on top of conventional troops that will change the calculation in favour of Russia even further." Franak, we were saying before that Belarus, Lukashenko didn't necessarily want Russian military troops and hardware in the country, but because he is so dependent on Russia, he's not really able to say no. What kind of hardware is Lukashenko prepared to have in Belarus?
That's a good question. We are not sure if Lukashenko is in control or not. He thinks that he still can say, like Tokayev in Kazakhstan did, to say to CSTO troops, you can go home, and they did. But I'm not sure. We don't know as well what is the influence of Russian army in Belarusian army. Because on one hand, the commander-in-chief is Lukashenko, but on the other hand, there are joint commandment centers. When I was in Belarus army, we were reporting both to Russia and to Belarus. Regarding Lukashenko's behavior, I think he's trying to move between fires somehow, because he understands if he will allow to deploy Russian troops, Iskanders, S-400 systems, it will spark discontent among his supporters and among Belarusian armed forces who really believe Belarus must be sovereign and independent.
Keir, is Alexander Lukashenko stuck with whatever it is that Putin wants to do because his presidency largely depends on Russian support?
The way Lukashenko had carried out this balancing act between all of these conflicting interests, all of these conflicting pressures for a remarkably long time. But of course, that all came to a head when he could no longer remain in power without that Russian support on which he's now dependent. And Franak also made the point that it's not clear exactly how much freedom of maneuver he has, regardless of the fact that people within Belarus might want just as much as any other neighbor of Russia to be a sovereign, independent nation which actually determines their own future, as opposed to having it dictated by Moscow. Those are factors that we simply can't know any more than we can know whether the Russian forces currently there plan to actually be removed on February 20th, as they're now promising, or in fact, if they'll stay and, as Mr. Khara was explaining, pose problems far beyond Ukraine, actually challenges that are across the whole region, building up from this encirclement of Ukraine by this Russian military force.
Yeah, Alexander, let's talk more about that. Is the fear that Belarus is simply becoming another territorial resource for Putin to use to be able to strike at Europe, a sort of an extension of Moscow's military power?
Certainly, and I would like to just pick up a couple of ideas of my colleagues. We experienced here in Ukraine that Russia has been doing to Belarus so far. Firstly, we had the Black Sea Fleet stationing on our Crimean Peninsula, and the Russians were trying to avoid our restriction to reinforce their forces by moving them for, let's say, military drills, and then bringing back new equipment and weaponry and some new people to Crimea, violating our bilateral agreements. It was before 2014. And in 2014, we experienced something as we call the state hijack. So I don't know how Mr. Lukashenko is in control of his KGB and the military, and how the Russian special forces and the secret services are infiltrated into the Belarusian security apparatus. So certainly this is something of a major concern for us. Belarus played a pretty interesting role since 2014. Just because we just cut all the ties with the Russian, I mean trade, the direct flights with Russia, Belarus became a sort of a mediator, and they were enjoying the outflow of goods and services and people. So they were pretty much better off with this situation. But after some time, and especially after beating and shedding the blood of the citizens, of its own citizens, Lukashenko became more isolated, and certainly he is not received in Ukraine as a legitimate leader. So his rhetoric is more harsh towards Ukraine, and certainly some of his actions. And we've seen recently, I mean in January, Ukrainian state servers were under the attack from Belarus. And I have no doubt that it was not the operation of KGB, but was operation of KGB and FSB coordinated from Moscow. So Belarus is a proxy force, and it determined to be a proxy force, like proxy forces of Russia in Donetsk and Lugansk.
Yeah, Franak, let me put that question to you. Alexander raises the point: how much control does Lukashenko have over his own troops, his own special forces, and his own security in his own country?
I propose to distinct Belarus and Lukashenko's regime, because Lukashenko himself is very distant from Belarusian people. And we see it in service, we see it in our communication with people, that they are alienated from government more and more, and they don't believe the regime protects their interest. 58%, I guess, thinks that the regime is guilty in the crisis that is going on in Belarus right now. Lukashenko is definitely controlling police, special secret services, more or less KGB, special operation forces in the army. But for example, regular army, which was not involved in political crackdown on opponents, I think it's not so loyal to Lukashenko. This is why he's not involved in them. And in my opinion, I'm skeptical that Belarusian regular troops will participate in possible assault on Ukraine. Because these people don't see Ukraine as enemy. They don't see Poland, Lithuania, Latvia as enemies. Opposite, they are very friendly towards Western neighbors as well as to Russia. So I think Lukashenko makes big mistake if he believes that Belarusian troops and Belarusian society will agree and will support any assault on our brother Ukrainian neighbor.
We'll talk more about that in just a minute. I want to address this question of whether Russia is going to have a permanent presence in Belarus with you. At a recent meeting with a Ukrainian MP, Lukashenko said Russian troops will be withdrawn from Belarus. He said, "We will find out when we decide to do it with the president of Russia and when the exercises will end here. We will make the decision. This is our territory." Keir, I wonder if Lukashenko perhaps is deluding himself. Do you think Russian troops are going to be leaving on February the 20th?
Well, at this point, it is a 50-50. It's a toss-up, because this is, in some respects, a familiar routine. We've seen this situation many times before, such as, for example, each time Russia and Belarus hold together the Zapad exercises, West exercises, there is a delivery of Russian troops to Belarus, and then they go home, usually on the promised date or thereabouts. What's different now, of course, is this tense situation with Ukraine and the fact that President Putin may wish to launch those troops in any other direction. And that's what is introducing this new and unpredictable factor where we simply cannot tell. What we have to hope is that when they agree that Russian troops will leave Belarus, they leave Belarus for Russia instead of into Ukraine.
So at the moment, I think I'm right in saying Russia has got 4 established air bases in Belarus, but until now, Lukashenko has restricted their use to scheduled manoeuvres. Keir, do you think that could change, and there could be some kind of rotational military presence in Belarus?
Well, that's a slightly misleading picture when you think of how exactly Belarus has resisted the actual setting up of Russian air bases and protection of its territory from the air by Russia in the past. Now, certainly you do have air deployments in Belarus from Russia at the moment, but that's very different from them having a permanent base which has been set up, again, effectively to outsource the defense of Belarus. That would be a major step forward, which we have not seen yet, despite, as you heard earlier from the other guests, all of the serious weaponry being brought into Belarus that can threaten not only Ukraine, but also Belarus's NATO neighbors.
Yeah.
In fact, what you're seeing here with Russia is exactly what Russia accuses NATO of doing. Supposedly, NATO troops keep moving forward to Russia's borders. Now, in fact, it's Russia that is doing precisely that, using Belarusian territory to arrive on the borders of Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Yeah, and that was exactly the point you were making, Alexander, that the troops in that region aren't just threatening Ukraine, but they're threatening the whole sort of eastern flank in Europe. How much of a concern is the prospect of a permanent Russian deployment in Belarus?
Well, I think it's going to happen for sure, even though the Lukashenko regime rejected those ideas before, but it was before he was holding this shameful election. So I think at the moment, Putin might use him as his proxy, as I told before. And I believe that the Russians haven't failed to achieve their primary goal with regard to Ukraine and Europe in general so far. They would love to use those 4 proxy forces to deny their involvement. So I believe escalations that we witnessed overnight in occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk, there will be something of that kind against possibly Lithuania or Poland. And the Putin would be in position to deny his involvement in such thing. I will remind you of the migration crisis that we've seen a couple of months ago, forged by the Russian and the Belarusian special forces and the security services to put some pressure on Lithuania and Poland. So they are going to do all that kind to show that Article 5 doesn't work with regard to the NATO members of the eastern flank, and that the deterrence measures implied by Mr. Biden and the West in general with regard to Ukraine are not, violated. So Putin has upper hand on those, let's say, issues. So I believe there will be some kind of gray zone operations in Ukraine and in Belarus against the Western countries.
And Franak, I want to come back to you on the point about opposition to any kind of invasion attempt of Ukraine by Belarusians. But what could Belarusians do if that is what Putin decides he wants to do, to use Belarus as a proxy, as a way in to invade Ukraine? Belarusians have very little power to oppose that, don't they?
Oh, definitely. Mass protests are impossible right now because repressions are very high, very intense. More than 1,050 political prisoners and thousands are in jails or sentenced to forced labor. But we had a survey conducted among protest audience, and 28% said that they're ready to protest again, and 11% said that they are ready to protest more actively, more radically, to resist or to fight for liberation of Belarus if Belarusian army or Belarus territory will be involved in assault on Ukraine. So I think this situation, this crisis with Ukraine, it mobilized Belarusian society, it politicized part of the societies which do not want war. We see something like anti-war movement appearing on our eyes, and this is kind of inspiring, I must say, for myself, because after since 2020, I think we see the major spark of societal mobilization right now.
And this issue of whether Lukashenko would allow nuclear weapons to be based in Belarus. This is something that he's resisted till now, but I understand there could be a change in the constitution which allows him to do that.
This is something he was trying to sell to Putin. Again, he's going to Putin. In 1 week, he is going to hold a referendum sham fake referendum imitation. And this referendum doesn't solve any crisis, but it eliminate neutrality from Belarus constitution and non-nuclear status from Belarus constitution, which will allow Lukashenko to place nuclear weapons again. And this is very dangerous, and Western countries, international community must respond firmly to this, including very strong sanctions on Lukashenko and his cronies. This is the only way to deter, to stop him from selling Belarus sovereignty, because this is exactly what's happening.
Okay. Keir, what kind of threat does this pose to NATO's eastern flank? I mean, even if an invasion of Ukraine doesn't happen, you have this pressure from Russian presence in the region. So what does this mean for NATO?
Well, that's exactly right. Russia poses a problem simply by being there. Now, to take one very simple example, we've heard a lot of talk about how a vulnerable point for NATO is the so-called Suwalki Gap or Suwalki Corridor. It's the land bridge that unites the Baltic states and Poland, and effectively the only way of reaching the Baltic states by NATO, running around that Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. We've heard lots of scenarios for how that might be a target for Russian activity, but of course, they all fell down on the simple fact that Russian troops were simply not present in Belarus to carry out the operations that we've described. That's now changed, so we have completely different options for Russia. We also potentially have Russia setting itself up for an apparent compromise with the West, because that presence of nuclear weapons in Belarus ties in precisely to Russia's current treaty demands on the West about nuclear weapons being returned to national territory. The aim of that is to make sure that Russia is the only country that has tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. And actually presenting the removal of them from Belarus as a major concession to the West is a way in which Russia could persuade Western powers, particularly the United States, to go along with its wishes.
So let's talk about whether the situation can be de-escalated. Alexander, we've been hearing that Russia says it's removed some of its troops from the Ukrainian border. No one seems to believe that. Can you tell us what the situation is?
According to the open source intelligence and the information from the Ukrainian authorities and Americans, the Russians are not withdrawing the troops, so they are playing with us. Redirecting the forces from one point to another point, and even threatened. They brought closer 7,000 soldiers closer to Ukrainian border. So they are playing this game, and we understand that Russia is an existential threat to Ukraine, and this is not the end of the crisis. So they would be willing to exploit our internal weaknesses. If they fail, they can apply the brutal military force, as we've seen it in Donetsk and Lugansk. So it's not the end of the crisis. Russia has not changed its goal, and unfortunately, they still have some resources to fulfill those goals. That's why we are calling for the West to impose sanctions right away, not to wait when there is too late and when there is an invasion of Ukraine. And I should remind you that the most harsh sanctions imposed on Russia were not related to the killing of Ukrainians by the Russians, but the downing of the MH17 over Ukrainian skies. So I believe the West needs to realize that Russia is a clear danger to peace and security on the continent, and it should be dealt more seriously than before.
So just to be clear, you think the West needs to take stronger action right now?
That's right. There should be preemptive sanctions to show the seriousness of the West. So far, American diplomacy has been great. They united the whole European countries, and especially France and Germany, with their particularly different view on Russia and their relations with Russia. So far, it was a united West, but there are some rifts. And I've seen it during the visits of Mr. Macron and Chancellor Scholz to Moscow. They were talking about bringing Russia to reshape the European security order, which is wrong. We could not have an order with someone who is a revisionist, who wants to undermine sovereignty of other states, and who doesn't want to see Europe in peace and free with Americans on our side. So that's why I'm skeptical, and I believe it was wrong from the French and German to show that there are some rifts that Russia might exploit.
Okay, so very quickly to my other two guests. Keir, do you think we're going to see any kind of de-escalation or not?
No, I think this is going to continue as a status quo. I don't believe that the current activity that we're seeing just this morning in eastern Ukraine is necessarily the prelude to an invasion, but also there is no point in listening to Russia's suggestions that it's actually pulling troops back, because they never actually turn out to be entirely true as they are on face value. So it is still entirely up in the air as to whether Russia will in fact mount a new major offensive against Ukraine. It's not inevitable.
Keir, thank you. And Franak, do you agree? More sanctions, tougher action against Russia?
Primarily against Lukashenko, because Lukashenko is the part of the problem. This started not this year, but in 2020 for Belarus. And Lukashenko used this escalation, this crisis, in order to hide domestic political problems, to hide repressions, terror. And the West, European Union, the United States must impose the strongest sanctions on Lukashenko to deter him and to raise the cost of everything he's doing in terms of regional security, but also human rights in Belarus.
Franak, thank you very much indeed. Keir, Alexander, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Roundtable. And don't forget, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.